Welcome to the Living Medicine podcast, where we talk about ethical medical use of psychedelic psychotherapy, teaching skills, examining the issues, and interviewing interesting people. Now let's start today's show.
Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Sandy Newis with Living Medicine Institute, and Living Medicine Institute is a business that provides resources and training and content and community for professionals, clinical and medical professionals, and interested folks who are interested in this psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy and the practice of that. And I'm really honored today to have Dr. Gita Vaid, who I met at a retreat that she was helping to co-lead through Ketamine Training Center, and that's how I know her. And then I have since seen you speak at conferences, and I've seen YouTube videos and this and that, and I'm really honored to have Dr. Vaid here. And so I'll give you her formal bio first, which is she is a board-certified psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, which is something that we're going to talk some about, I hope. Practicing ketamine-assisted psychotherapy in New York City. She is co-founder of the Center for Natural Intelligence, which is a multidisciplinary laboratory dedicated to psychedelic psychotherapy innovation and clinical practice. She's on the faculty at NYU Medical Center and a psychoanalytic training at the Psychedelic Association of New York. She's trained in lots of many different things. And I also know, I believe, right, that you are one of the trainers with the MindMed program as well, which is an international program teaching about psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So that's the formal. Is there anything that I missed in there that you want to add that people want to know about you on the kind of what you do in the world side?
No, I think you pretty much covered everything. And thank you for having me on the podcast. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Good. Well, I am really thrilled to be here. And as you know, I have always just been very impressed by your ability to articulate the complex clinical process that is really found in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And, many people, are like, aren't you just kind of like hanging out? And hopefully we're past that as a field, but there are still many people who think that that's just what we're doing. So for the people who are listening, my hope is that we'll be weaving that in, just some discussions of the more kind of complex clinical processes and also innovation that can be found in this. But I want to start, just because I always love to start with this, is like, kind of how did you make your way to the psychedelic field, and what draws you and what keeps you there? Like, what excites you? Like, how did you find yourself like on this path, like committed to this?
Well, actually, the way I got into it is an interesting story. And in hindsight, I think that, oftentimes I think people who get into this work feel like, there's sort of an unfolding that happens, which very much mirrors, I think, the psychedelic process of healing itself.
Mm-hmm.
I was in private practice for quite a long time, already a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst, and really enjoying clinical work, doing psychodynamic psychotherapy predominantly, and also psychopharm for usually for colleagues who I would not really work with individuals who just wanted to dampen symptoms, but to manage symptoms for my own patients who were interested in the deeper process, or colleagues who were psychotherapists. I was really interested in pharmacology too. And one of my close colleagues who I admire was an older psychoanalyst who had the privilege of working with Dr. Humphrey Osmond back in the day. And Dr. Humphrey Osmond, as many people might know, was the psychiatrist who worked with alcoholism a lot in Canada.
Yeah.
And he coined the term psychedelics, actually, because he was using LSD psychotherapy at that point. So my colleague told me all about his experiences. And in those days, you could write to Sandoz and get a vial of LSD for research.
Excuse me, can I get some of that, please?
Sure,
nice. There you go.
So he pretty much did this, and with his young therapy friends, they explored and experimented, and he talked so much about how it changed his life. So I heard a lot about this from people who were back in the earlier wave of psychedelics, and it was beyond fascinating. And I just thought, well, that's not happening in my life and in my career. But I was on faculty at NYU, so I did wind up with him connecting with the group, with Steve Ross's group, who were doing a lot of work with psilocybin at the time, with end-of-life anxiety and depression, with also Dr. Gus. And I was really interested in the research that was coming out. But actually, I think what really galvanized my own personal journey was I was working with a gentleman that I would only meet with twice a year for psychopharm follow-up, just to refill his sleeping meds, his as-needed meds. He was doing great. And he came in for a follow-up visit. And the experience of sitting with him was incredibly different. So I kept on burrowing around, asking what was different in his life. And in terms of his everyday life, nothing had changed.
Oh, interesting.
And so I finally asked him, like, he's like, what are you trying to get at? And I said, I'm trying to understand. I just leveled with him.
Yeah.
Why it's so different sitting with you. And he said, what's so different? And I said, I can have emotional connection with you like I've never experienced before. And
Yeah.
I'm scratching my head, wondering what's different. And your relationship is the same. Your life and work is the same. And he said, is it that noticeable? And it was
Interesting.
And he was the one who told me he was working with an underground facilitator. Not because he had end-of-life cancer and anxiety, but because he was in his 80s and he figured, I'm dealing with mortality and it's more imminent than when I was younger. And this underground therapist has changed my life.
Yeah.
So I asked him, would you ask that therapist if he'd be interested and open to have a conversation with me? And that's really where I got much more intrigued, because that person who's now become a friend, mentor, colleague, he really spoke my language as a psychoanalyst and really showed me with this one person how this was possible. And really, in my own experience, I saw the access it allowed one to have. And the healing potential became very apparent to me. And that sparked my journey.
So it was kind of through the research side, you're getting exposed to that. You're kind of in, New York City in that hotbed of psychoanalysis, and, and then you see this patient who's just like remarkably different. Oh, how interesting.
In my mind.
Right? Huh. And good for you for noticing that. I bet he was like, what? So then you went on and, started to do this clinically. I know you're still involved in research and, kind of
very interested. Then I felt I need to know what's going on in the field. And I started, getting involved with MAPS, becoming a MAPS therapist, and really learning everything, working with a lot of underground facilitators to learn everything I could about it. At that point, it was early in the second wave, so people were very accessible and excited and open. And I saw Dr. Phil Wolfson talking at a bunch of conferences and thought he was brilliant, and was starting to hear about ketamine and read about it. And then when he announced his first training in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, I pretty much bombarded him with emails because he was never getting back to me saying, I want to be part of this. And he finally said, stop writing to me. You're on the list. Calm down.
Okay.
Go to the training. And got very excited about it. And he invited me to teach at the Ketamine Training Center. And it really transformed my practice, because here was a medicine that was available, short acting and very much user-friendly right now.
Good. Great. So let's just to give a little context, we don't need to get in all the differences or routes of administration and stuff, but in your clinical practice, so just so that people have context, like what route of administration do you use? And, do you have like a large practice, small practice, medium practice? And then do you have a clinical specialty? So I want to get into the clinical process next, but I just want to make sure that people have context.
Yeah, I have a small private practice in New York City. It hasn't really changed in a way that much from when I first started off in terms of my interest. Everything has changed because I'm now a psychedelic psychotherapist. But I work in my practice and I work with ketamine. I use the intramuscular administration. So that's pretty much what I use for a variety of reasons. I was using lozenges and intramuscular, but there's a lot of issues with me getting lozenges these days because of really because of the businesses. I'll lose my ability to get the IM if I use them. It's a whole complicated thing that many people are aware of. So I work with the IM, and I would say my practice has always been, even when I was a psychotherapist, is if someone was in crisis, I would stabilize them. But really, I was interested in doing the deeper process to get to the underpinnings of healing and seeing how much plasticity there was to get to the deeper layers of why someone is depressed or anxious or not feeling their best or thriving. And the same is true with psychedelic psychotherapy. If someone is in deep despair or suicidal, I might advise them to actually go to an IV clinic to get stable. And then when they're stable, they might come back to me to do the deeper process of, now your head is above water. Let's get to work. And when someone's drowning, it's hard to do the deeper work because the issue is stabilizing. But I'm really much more interested. So I, really work with people doing 3-hour sessions to try and get to the deeper process and activate, their own healing.
Nice. All right. So let's talk about that. So, we can just start general. I know that I have heard you talk about psychodynamic psychotherapy or a psychoanalyst. I also, was trained in psychodynamic with a real focus on the use of the relationship in the present moment. And so, those are some things, that really captured my attention. So just in thinking about that, like, if you consider yourself to be a psychodynamic or, psychoanalytic therapist using ketamine, like what does that look like? What is your, like, tell me about your clinical approach.
Well, I would say a lot of the pieces of how I work, which is fairly similar to you, I think, in terms of being very interested in the relationship, using a relationship, being in the present moment, using transference, all of that is applicable. So a lot of my skills that I honed as a psychoanalyst or a psychodynamic psychotherapist are still incredibly relevant and applicable. And so what I do in my office, I really would say is really psychedelic psychotherapy, because I think it's actually, even though the some of the tenets are the same, the application is different.
Yeah.
Highly relational. I think one of the big shifts that I like to think about is with psychodynamic psychotherapy, it's very much focused on how is the past affecting the present moment? How are these interjects or dynamics that are patterns that we hold in our mind and in our body? How do they play out in the present moment in one's everyday life?
Yeah.
And oftentimes, a lot of the work is trying to elucidate those kind of parallels, and more importantly, seeing them in the transference in the room right there. So in that kind of crucible in the transference, you can kind of have a chance of working through them. And
Can you give an example of that? Like, I think a lot of times people throw around those terms, but people are kind of hungry, like I do a whole extensive developmental history during preparation, which is not something that everybody does, but I can't really work without it. And I would assume that you do some of that as well. And then I'm also just curious how it shows up in the session then.
Well, I was going to say that's more for what I do with psychodynamic stuff. With the psychedelic psychotherapy, it's a little bit different. For me, I like to understand those patterns, and I assume they're playing out. But more, I'm interested in let's try and elucidate them, not to kind of labor over it as I would have done in exhaustive detail as a psychotherapist. More to realize, okay, so now you and I are up to speed. They're probably playing out in the present moment, and that's your prison. And how do and also it's not only your prison, it's your cage, but it's also solving a lot of underlying problems to allow you to be safe and be in the world safely and thriving. How do we actually fix the underlying problems which allow you to break out of that box and actually flourish into ways that have previously not been available or established? So it really shifts it from backward focusing to actually future thinking. So I think that's the big pivot that I really appreciate with this work. To your point of how does that look in the room, I would say it plays out in many different ways. A lot of it has to do with deep listening, of trying to listen to what's happening, following the person's process. A lot of it is providing, I think, certain capacities that the person hasn't really able to receive, or even if they have, they're not in such an open state where they can actually absorb the feelings or the information. In some ways, it's like almost upgrading the operating system in this crucible. Because under psychedelics, as you know, the mind and body is primed for transformation, and we can really take in new stimuli. And, it has to be accurate, otherwise it's not going to resonate. But in that moment, someone is really able to hear and see and be reflected back and understand what's happening. And I'll say what happens oftentimes, a common thing that happens is when I will share things I'm noticing the person's session, they will say, "Oh my goodness, Dr. Vaid, you're brilliant." And I will say, actually, everything I said is what you said. I'm very good at listening and reflecting back. And then they'll think about it and say, "You know what? You're right." But I never remembered it or been able to see it had you not been able to hold it up for me. And I would say it's a very different, and then there's other subtleties that come with it. But I think that that's a big piece of the corrective experience that's possible. And filling in some of these foundational deficits that we all hold. And then I think from that, almost following what's happening and how do we kind of keep that going so the person can move forward in their life.
So when you say corrective experience, are you talking about that witnessing? I know people use different words. So what you just said, the attunement, the witnessing, the mirroring, the noticing what they're saying, the awareness of their patterns, the it sounds to me like you're talking about the felt sense of them being in relationship with you. Is that
Yes,
what you
I
mean
think
by
there's
that?
a lot of attachment stuff. So a lot of the things you mentioned, I think, are there, but it also plays out so uniquely for different people. And I'll give you an
Mm,
example of how it can play out in very unique ways because we're all so different. This is a gentleman, an older fellow I'd been working with successfully in psychodynamic psychotherapy for a few years, and he'd done quite well. And when he did his first ketamine session, we had a long history of working together well. I was really a bit puzzled because he listened to the music, and with my office, I kind of like to have the music be in a speaker so that we're both held in the music. So the music is the
yeah.
container within the room. And he actually kind of said, I don't know if I want you listening to the music. And I was like,
Oh,
what do you mean? He said, I think if you don't mind, I think I'd like to have my own music that's just mine. And I don't know if I want you to be part of the session. And it was so interesting to me because this was a man who could not have been more of a pleaser. In fact, that was
yeah.
the course of the work was about him learning about his pleasing tendencies, his caregiving tendencies, and to have awareness of that tendency. So this was not him being a pleaser. But what it actually turned out being, and we actually kind of modified it, I didn't
Mm,
analyze it. We kind of said, well, the next session you can bring in your own headphones. We'll have
yeah.
music be your music. And he said, I'd prefer if you don't talk to me. I don't want you to touch me. I don't want you to. It was by his rules.
Okay.
But a lot of it was about him feeling what he came to understand was he had felt so intruded upon in terms of
Mm,
boundaries with his mother and enmeshment, and so much of his pleasing and being an extension of her for safety was what we talked about, but in a very present here and now experiential
mm,
way. He was
yeah.
taking charge and drawing the limit and having his boundaries and telling me, here's how you're going to help me. Here's how you're not. I want my own space. And really was
Mm,
drawing it. And so I was a little bit shooting in the dark initially. I could sense a process is happening. But it was fascinating to me to see how, in his case, it was listening, reflecting, responding, but it was almost the inverse of what I was typically used to. But it's so creative and such an amazing way he was able to use the session skillfully to listen to his own needs and process to really heal himself.
interesting. So how did that unfold? Were you just quiet the whole time and then you did that work in integration, or did he eventually take off the headphones, or
No,
how did
he
that
saw
work?
that and it was really helpful for him. Over time, he decided he wanted to take the headphones off and he was much more
Mm,
able to share the space. And this corresponded in his outer life of being able to sort of set limits and not be so inclined to give himself away, which did cause some friction in his relationships in his everyday,
mm,
which was not easy, but he really felt I have to be true to myself. I've given myself away and was able to navigate that and get to a place both in relationships outside in the world as well as in the session of we can have a shared space and
yeah.
neither of us have to be tugging at you for you. And so
Mm,
that was really reflected in being able to share in the same space and loosen up some of the need for his own boundaries and protectiveness. So it was
mm.
very interesting how it was really a process which we could see mirrored out in the session and outside of the session.
Oh, how interesting. Actually have had a few clients through the years. I talk most of the time. I'm not just me, but we're engaged, which is one of the things that people don't always realize. I think more and more people do, but that ketamine assisted psychotherapy, at least the way we do it and I do it, is that we are talking. But I occasionally I'll have somebody who just wants to quietly sit there, and that the feeling into just the fact that I'm still there and I'm still with them, that we're not just sitting there, like they're still feeling, I call it like in the bubble, like we're still in the bubble with them.
We're definitely in the bubble with them. And this, I'm not sure why this wonderful patient comes to mind today as I'm talking to you, but I think it's a good example because this was a person that, as I started off saying, I prided myself on working quite successful with him for several years in psychotherapy. The other thing about the case that was really remarkable to me, and this is one of my earlier patients, um, I was really amazed that a lot of what we had talked about his past, and he'd been successfully married for quite a long time with two grown children. Um, he talked a lot to me initially about the trauma of his first wife who had made a suicide attempt in front of him. And this was
Oof,
decades earlier. But when he came to
right.
treatment, he was married for, I think, 20 years, grown
Yeah.
children. There were other issues that were more prominent. So I was aware of that history, and we talked because it was quite remarkable. But I was shocked that all of that came up in a very vivid way, which was, of course, trauma that had been suppressed, but was really suddenly available to be processed and felt together. And it wasn't that I didn't know this stuff, but I this time was listening to it and feeling together what the pain was. And it was really a challenging session for me because as he was then burdening himself of the experience and in a way recounting exactly what happened in painful detail, I was sitting with him and it was almost like he was processing it and passing the feelings to me, and for me to, in a way, digest what was intolerable for him.
Yeah.
It was heavy duty work and beautiful work. And I think that's what's interesting for a lot of people is sometimes ketamine can very much mimic how we think of MDMA psychotherapy. I think an often have these visions that MDMA is for PTSD and ketamine is for depression, and all bets are off when it comes to healing and psychedelics.
Oh, I'm so glad that you said that because I see MDMA like effects all the time. Like, I mean, I do series. I do like 6 sessions over 3 to 4 weeks. And so they build on each other. And then we teach from that perspective. And I think when you're in that, we can bring in like Goldolan's work about the, critical reward learning period and what happens there with the neuroplasticity. But, I see this huge relational trauma processing thing when the container is created in that way. So I love that you said that. So please share more of your thoughts about that.
Well, I just think that I'm really interested in the process because it's so remarkable to me how healing happens and how you do this to each of us. And I would say for me, and I think you just sort of, very much kind of said what to me is the most magical about this work when I can be in a process with someone where I feel like in session number 4, I can look back and see how it arrived from session 3 or session 2. And I could have never from session 2 predicted where it was going to go. I know that something is happening and there's a real unfolding happening. And that to me is, something I keep an eye on because if we can achieve that, that to me is, we're where we want to be.
Yeah. So your approach to working with trauma, like, can you say, everybody kind of has a different approach depending on where they come from and their background and their training. Like, how would you describe your approach? And once again, just, like just kind of to name it, like when I first started in the ketamine field in 2019, people were saying like, no, not ketamine for trauma, that's bad, which I think probably comes from the ketamine clinics where there isn't psychotherapy. So that's just to kind of inform people as we're going through it. So, what are your thoughts on how do you work with it, the effectiveness of the use of ketamine specifically for trauma? And, what have you seen in the relationship to what you've also seen with MDMA?
I would say for me, the way I work with it is I think I've gotten more skilled. And of course, it is a never-ending process.
Right.
I do feel like for me, I think if I look back, I feel like I was so much fancier when I first started and so much more cautious. And now I feel like I'm less fancy. When I say fancy, I had all of these interesting protocols of how to work with patients and different.
I love them. Use the word fancy.
And now I feel like what I really am is much more skilled at listening to the process, trusting the process, and following the person's process, which is way beyond anything I could conceive of or anything I could imagine. And I think that's been really helpful because I think early on, if someone had a really difficult session or a dark session, I would be a bit concerned, is this helpful? It's really useful for the person. And now I have 100% conviction that those are the sessions where the person is really safe enough to grow themselves.
Oh, nice.
A lot of it has to do with, I think one of the pieces that I value about the work is for me, healing is really growing ourselves to be able to hold both the dark and the light within us and to really be able to, not work it out or metabolize it. Sure, but some of the stuff might be just through life. We have to just grow ourselves to be able to not suppress it, not to use so much energy to avoid it or to cope with it by evacuating it, instead of being able to grow ourselves to process and ride through the feeling states, both internally and then through life, so you can have more of your energy available to be alive. And so I think that's a big aspect of trauma and healing. And so to your point, how do I work with it is I really try and follow the process and I try and open up a process with a person. And if that can happen, then I feel we're doing something right, and I trust and I'll follow it. And the person does it at their own pace. Sometimes it's a lot about building safety. Other times the person is ready to dive into the work right away.
Good. So you've mentioned attachment, and when you're talking and the person feels safe, the person feels like they're ready to do the work. I mean, to me, that's inherently relational, like that you're building safety with them. And what are your thoughts on working with attachment, which is inherently part of trauma? And I mean, I will say that early on when I started doing this work, I've been doing it since 2019. There were some times when what I now think was attachment stuff would come up, and the person would get kind of resistant or want to kind of pull back, or maybe they wanted to do it on their own. And I think I have also kind of learned different techniques because that's not happening anymore. But I do think there's something about the intensity of the relationship that can be really healing, but may also sometimes people bounce off of that. I'm just curious about your thoughts.
I'm really glad you mentioned it. I think that psychedelics really allow us to get to the deepest stages of healing and deep attachment work, which I think in some ways is the underpinning. In a way, trauma happens on the matrix in which the person is receiving the trauma. So, two people can have the same traumatic event, and one person could be less scathed by it than someone who had a history of trauma where it sort of evokes. I was just talking to a new patient yesterday who was telling me how there was a big betrayal in his business, which would be traumatic, I think, for most people to have a big betrayal in a business venture. But for him, it was a bit of a double whammy because he said he'd been bullied in high school for many years. And suddenly it felt like not only was he being betrayed in a business venture, they were very bullying towards him. And then it opened up this history of being bullied, which then had even earlier roots. So I do feel like attachment in a certain sense is the earliest kind of matrix with which all of these later events reside. And the other part of it is, in psychedelic psychotherapy, I think we talk a lot about how we heal ourselves. And I think I've even said that a bunch of times already, how much I like to follow the person's process so they can do their own healing work. But I think that's 50% of it. I think we heal ourselves, we heal each other. And I really think the balance of that is 50-50, which I don't think too many people in the field think about. I think they think it's largely the person. And I think we heal ourselves and we heal each other because I think we can't see ourselves. So we need to witness us. And that's a skill that I can say that we have to cultivate within ourselves. And so I would say that to me, everything, I think relationships are the crucible for healing. I think we can't really heal ourselves, just like we can't analyze ourselves, even if we're really, really sophisticated psychotherapists. We're going to be a lousy psychotherapist if we think we're the one who's going to heal ourselves or analyze ourselves. And I think that is true of psychedelic work or healing work in general. We need each other. We need relationship. And that's really where all of this stuff comes alive.
Nice. I love that. So, the piece, what you just said, I want to just highlight that, because this work is so nurturing and powerful for me, like to be able to kind of go into the bubble with a client and have the trust and the honoring of being in there. And it's also a very meditative state. We can make light of it and say there's like a contact high, but it's more, you're in, to use your word, you're in the process with them. And it's very, very rich on a personal level. And I feel like it impacts me all the time.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a very open field. It's very undefended. I also think a big aspect of the relationship repair and the work is intimacy. I think the deeper someone can go within themselves, the deeper they're available to be in relationship with another person. You really see that very, very deeply in the psychedelic space. The person is dropping in, particularly with ketamine work. They're dropping out of thinking mind. They're going to deeper places. Feelings are coming up, sensations that they're holding in their body. They're going deeper behind their everyday kind of space that they live in. They're going deeper within themselves. And sometimes you get a hint into why they were blocked from those deeper places. Pain comes up, feelings come up, grief comes up. But the deeper they can go with themselves, the deeper they're available for the new relationship. And the first one is going to be right there with the therapist in the room to feel. And that then very quickly translates into the person having more of themselves available for relationship in everyday life.
I love that. I mean, that applies with psychedelics and also traditional psychotherapy, that it's just like we can free that up. So you mentioned thoughts and feelings and sensations, which is a great kind of segue into the next thing I wanted to just check in with you about. I've been kind of working with this theory on like state versus content. Like, is it the processing of the content? And then with the relationship being kind of a critical bridge, or are we helping people learn to kind of, to kind of draw from Bessel van der Kolk's work about just shifting state and being able to, be in well-being and to have a more flexible way of being in the world? And I'm just curious, for you, what are your thoughts on the balance of being, the specifics around processing content versus helping somebody shift state? And or are those even separate distinctions for you?
Well, the way I would, what it brings up for me, listening to those two different points, I would say that, I think we get attached to our trauma. As human beings, I think we tend to get an identity becomes what are our problems, and psychotherapy tends to reinforce that. But even if not, I do think very quickly, once we start healing ourselves and doing some of our processing and having more access to what's beneath the surface in ourselves, very quickly, I think it shifts away into more of a flourishing and well-being. And how much can we liberate of having more goodness in our life? Can we let go of some of these negative influences, and can we actually open ourselves up to more? And I think that's a pivot, and that's a shift that I think can be really cultivated and reinforced. And those equilibriums and set points, I think, shift. And I do see this all the time, that in psychedelic work, very quickly, after, when I say quickly, I said after we do enough healing work, it does shift into how much goodness can you tolerate in your life? Could you tolerate letting go some of those issues? Could you write your own story? Could you live the life you want instead of replaying those patterns or complaining about what you didn't get? What if you're the author of your own life and you could yourself? So I think it shifts a little bit into a very different way of, are you ready to let this go now? And ready to have a different life, the one that you are in charge of or entitled to, and how much can you allow yourself? So I think it's surprising. You would think, well, who wouldn't be running to do that? But as it turns out, that's heavy work for all of us. That's not things are built. So in theory, it's great. In practice, it's not so easy. And I see this all the time, that the person is trying to provide more for themselves and they run into a lot of anxiety. That I even happened this morning in a session. The person said, my life is going amazingly well. And I said, and yet what? And they said, I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. And we talked about how much that anxiety, that it's all going to fall apart, that she's not really allowed to have such freedom from anxiety and pain and suffering, including even in her sense of herself. She's like, I'm really quite confident. I'm doing this well. My life is going well. And usually her sense of herself was being, not good enough, not as brilliant. And we could really, and she's done a lot of amazing work to get herself to this place, but you could see she was pushing back to, it's all going to fall apart. I'm not allowed to have so much goodness. So that's one thing about.
I see that a lot, like the fear of like, there is a mower out there. So listeners, sorry. Like suddenly I'm having this moment where the mower is getting closer and closer. What can we do? But I think that the piece about actually helping people feel safe, feeling at least okay, if not well, is a really big part of this work.
I agree. I think safety is critical. I think for some people, like ketamine and psychedelics oftentimes take someone to the place of safety, sometimes for the first time.
Yeah.
Almost just learning and discovering, what is it like to be me, or what is it like to be yourself when you're not in survival. And all that.
Oh, that's a nice phrase. What is it like to be you when you're not in survival mode?
And for a lot of people, it's a discovery.
Yeah, I love that. So I want to switch gears a little bit and just, you're involved in training, I'm involved in training, like there's more and more training programs popping up. And tell me your thoughts on, how do we train people well? Like, what do people need to know? And what's the mark of a good training program? And those of us who are in it, like, what do we need to be focused on? And if somebody's looking for good training, like what should they be looking for?
No, I think that's a really challenging question. Like, how do you...
It's a huge question.
Yeah, I don't think it's an easy one. I like this interview and the podcast focus, because you're really focusing on process. And I think that to understand the process in some ways, from my way of thinking, I was a psychiatrist and I did a lot of training, and then became a psychoanalyst. And actually, I think it was really from my own self-work of understanding the process of psychoanalysis. Certainly, I learned a lot from having many patients in psychoanalysis with me and going to supervision and reading the papers. But the critical piece for me was not only the didactics or the supervision, it was really understanding through experience. And that's what you have to do if you become a psychoanalyst. You have to be in your own analysis, which for me went on way too long, 8 years, or a long time.
That's a long time.
One thing it did do is it really helped me understand the process. What is early stage psychoanalysis, mid stage, all of that. And I think that you don't have to be a psychoanalyst and go through that to be a psychedelic psychotherapist. But I do think understanding the process, to me, nothing rivals it than understanding an unfolding process. And I've done so much training myself, being a psychopharmacologist, a psychiatrist, a psychoanalyst. And I can say, speaking for myself, nothing prepared me for the psychedelic psychotherapy process. I had to go through it myself to understand it fully in a way that gave me a sense of how I can best support another person. So that's one thing that it depends, I think, on how you're working. But if you're doing the kind of deep process work, I think that's what's been the most helpful for me. And how do we part what the process looks like so people can understand it through didactics, through clinical experience, through discussions. But I think there's nothing that parallels self-work and self-experience of one's own unfolding.
Right. I mean, one of the kind of, I don't know about the training. I mean, I know that Ketamine Training Center does a lot of experientials, and we actually do 7 medicine sessions in our level 1 clinical intensive. And, I'm just, so sounds like that's something you would share, that people, should really also be looking for a training program where they get enough experiential to really understand the rhythm of it.
I think, to my mind, if you're doing this deeper work, I think that's a critical piece. The other part is I think that psychotherapy is such a rewarding field, even with or without medicines, because it's one that we grow at and we get better at. And I know that most psychotherapists, my colleagues, myself included, I'm always looking for new things. I'm always trying to develop myself. And it's so gratifying to get better. I mean, I've been doing this for 35 years and I'm so much better than I was 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And hopefully that continues throughout one's whole life. But I think self-development is a really important piece. How do we develop ourselves? And I think psychedelic psychotherapy is unique because it gets to these deeper places within ourselves and with other people. So how do we prepare ourselves to do that really, really depthful work with another person and become really skilled? And I think it calls for really a lot of self-development. And it actually is a labor of love because it's so gratifying to do this work and to be able to, it's almost like being in an archaeological site with a person's oldest experiences and memories and dream work all at once, except for you get to participate in it. But to really, it's such a magical, very, very unique field. How does one prepare to do that work and really not miss the opportunity with a person, or even worse, inadvertently, not drop the ball, which can ordinarily be not such a big deal because you can repeat in the next session. But in this work, it's quite unforgiving if you make a blunder because the person can be very wounded because the field is so open. So I think it's a really important piece, is not only doing your own work, but also how do we develop ourselves?
Right. I love that. Yeah. I mean, that's this work can turn you inside out, for the better, for the worse, but knowing that that's a part of the process. And, I think it's so important. Like, we're all in this together, like this is a new thing. So, yeah. So I know that you're also known as an innovator. And so I'm just, anything else that you'd like to say about that, innovation in the field, what the potential is, and then just anything else you'd like to share just in our last couple of minutes here.
I'm really interested in psychotherapy innovation. I just did an innovation project, which hopefully I'll be sharing at some conferences, looking at music. And what we did is we had 4 different skilled facilitators really displaying how they use their own models of the mind and psychotherapy models, and then weave that into music.
Interesting.
So we had Dr. Joe Tafor, who's an amazing clinician, and he's also an ayahuasquero. But we used ketamine, and he used his Icaros, which is really a very unique way of healing using sound, and it's very energetic to access trauma in the body. we had Name Natumai, who's an amazing facilitator, who used a model, reworking a feminist model of Stan Grof's birth trauma, where she really invited people to birth themselves through this incredible music that really allowed you to journey through the birth passage in your musical experience and to rebirth yourself. So it was a
Wow.
on breath work as well as a feminist reworking of Stan Grof's birth matrices. And then I had Barry Walker, who is an amazing clinician looking at character defenses and using music as an entree into exploring the layers of yourself. And the final one was East Forest, who's an incredible musician who a lot of facilitators are very familiar with his work. And he has a whole way of thinking about music as facilitator, and has a lot of music that is available and readily available for free on various platforms. And his thinking about how he uses music for people who, don't have access to treatment. And a lot of people are going to be doing their own work because they can't afford to go to a doctor's or a therapist's office, and how people who are going to be using these tools by themselves, how he thinks of healing and music. So as you can tell from this, I'm a big fan of us having new theoretical platforms, and to be a little bit more rigorous, not to squash the field, but to actually start building a whole new discipline, which is evidence-based. Because what I'm a little bit dismayed at is a lot of the studies are trying to fall back on evidence-based psychotherapies, which really have, in a way, it's staying with the old paradigm of healing and not moving forward with what's possible.
I mean, I share that. I understand from a research methodology perspective that we need to only change X amount of variables, and yet it is time for a new paradigm. It is time to do something different. It is time to look at new ways, and this is an entry way to do that. So I love that you said that. So anything else that you want to share with the listeners or the audience, or just kind of any other thoughts that you have?
I guess for people who are not so acquainted with this work, what I would say, when people oftentimes ask me to describe it, and I can talk endlessly, and oftentimes I'll ask people, did my explaining it help you understand and prepare you? And they say not at all. But I would say,
I personally think you're quite articulate.
The therapists or even patients who are interested in this, the thing that I've come to that I think is really tapped into in this work is the genius and creativity and power of dream work. And in dreams are just so magical, and every element is so saturated with significance and meaning and associations. And the dreamer, of course, is ourselves. And I think really that imagination and that creativity is really the piece that blows me away in this work, that the person's ingenuity in being able to craft together repair and healing is just phenomenal. And there's countless examples of it. But I would say in some ways we all have access to that because we've all dreamt our dreams. And I think it's really, that's the piece that this work captures and touches into.
I love that. So, well, thank you so much. I appreciate you sharing your wisdom and your clinical expertise and your thoughts and your passion. So I know that you are all into this work as I am, and many of us are. And so I know that the field has benefited. I personally have benefited. I hope that the listeners benefit. And I just really appreciate all that, the way you show up in the world and all of your knowledge and wisdom. So thank you so, so much.
Thank you so much, Sandy. It's been a pleasure to be in conversation with you. Thank you for having me.
Let me ask you one more thing. Is there a way people can find you? Do you have any upcoming events, any upcoming talks? Like how do people find you and get more opportunities to learn from you?
Thank you. I've actually been taking a little bit of a break from teaching, but I will be talking, hopefully I'm going to be applying to a few conferences to present this work on the music project, mostly in clinical practice, but there'll be more information at the website, centerfornaturalalintelligence.com.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Living Medicine. We'll see you again next time. Be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.